How does someone make history by dying the dumbest way possible? King John of England. King John, already famous for being such a catastrophically bad ruler that his own nobles forced him to sign away his power in the Magna Carta. Not content with merely losing most of his inherited territories and earning the charming nickname Lackland, Johnny decided to really cement his legacy as history's most incompetent monarch. While in the middle of a civil war, which he was losing naturally, his royal physicians took time out of their busy schedule to explain to him that eating massive quantities of fresh fruit during wartime stress was a terrible idea. But why listen to medical professionals when you're a king with the judgment skills of a toddler in a candy store? John proceeded to stuff his face with peaches, plums, and new cider like he was preparing for fruit hibernation. His doctors watched in horror as their patient ignored centuries of medical wisdom in favor of what was essentially a medieval fruit binge. Within days, the king, who had already proven he couldn't successfully rule a kingdom, demonstrated that he also couldn't successfully operate his own digestive system, dying of dysentery brought on by his own spectacular gluttony. Attila the Hun. Meet Attila, the guy who spent his entire career making Roman emperors wet themselves in fear, and carved out an empire stretching across Europe through sheer brutality and tactical genius. This absolute unit of a warlord could plan military campaigns that crushed armies, navigate complex political alliances, and strike terror into the hearts of civilizations. But apparently, the one enemy he couldn't defeat was wedding night enthusiasm. After marrying a lovely young Gothic woman named Ildiko, our brilliant military strategist decided to celebrate by consuming roughly the entire contents of his wine cellar. The man who had outmaneuvered Rome's finest generals couldn't figure out that chugging wine like it was going out of style might be a bad idea. The next morning, his new bride found him face down in a pool of his own blood, having either choked on his own nosebleed or suffered internal bleeding from what was essentially the world's most epic hangover. The scourge of God, who brought down empires, was ultimately defeated by alcohol and gravity, Pope Adrian IV. Here we have the only English pope in history, a man who had climbed to the very pinnacle of medieval power and claimed to speak for God himself on earth. Adrian had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of church politics, dealt with emperors and kings as equals, and commanded the spiritual loyalty of millions across Europe. Surely such a brilliant and accomplished leader would meet his end in some appropriately dramatic fashion. Perhaps martyrdom, political assassination, or at least a decent plague. Instead, our infallible Holy Father was enjoying a nice glass of wine in his papal chambers when a fly, one tiny, insignificant fly, decided to crash his private party. Now, you'd think that someone with a direct line to the Almighty might get a heads up about incoming airborne insects, but apparently divine protection doesn't extend to pest control. The fly either dive-bombed into his wine or made a kamikaze run straight into his mouth, and suddenly the most powerful man in Christendom was choking like a common peasant. The Pope, who could theoretically excommunicate entire kingdoms, was taken out by an insect that weighed less than a communion wafer, proving that God really does have a sense of humor. King Henry I of England. Henry was actually a pretty decent king by medieval standards, having ruled England successfully for 35 years and managed to keep his kingdom relatively stable and prosperous. But like many powerful men, he had one fatal weakness. He absolutely could not take medical advice. His personal physician, you know, the guy whose entire job was keeping the king alive, had given him one simple rule: "Your Majesty, please don't eat lampreys. They will literally kill you." This wasn't exactly rocket science. It was basically medieval medicine's equivalent of don't stick a fork in an electrical outlet. But Henry, being a king and therefore convinced that royal blood made him immune to the basic laws of biology, decided that his doctor was just being overly cautious. While on a hunting trip, he was presented with a beautiful dish of fresh lampreys, and his thought process apparently went, Well, my medical professional with years of training specifically told me this would kill me, but I'm the king, so surely my royal digestive system operates on different principles than those of common mortals. He then proceeded to gorge himself on the forbidden fish like it was his last meal, which, as it turned out, it was. The man who had conquered Normandy was conquered by an eel, proving that evolution doesn't care about your crown. Edmund Ironside, King of England in 1016, wasn't handed his reputation, he earned it in blood and steel. The guy fought like a force of nature, shrugging off Danish invasions and throwing himself into battles where normal men would have bolted. He clashed with Viking berserkers in brutal close combat, led charges when the odds were stacked against him, and built a name as the kind of king whose enemies whispered about him in fear. You'd expect a man like that to meet his end in a blaze of fury, but fate, as it tends to, had a dark sense of humor. Some patient assassin had literally hidden in the royal outhouse, waiting for the king to show up and drop his guard. And well, his trousers. Chroniclers suggest it was part of a deliberate plot orchestrated by enemies who had realized that if Edmund couldn't be beaten on the battlefield, they'd have to find him in his weakest moment. And what's weaker than a king with his pants around his ankles? Imagine the patience and sheer misery of the assassin. This poor bastard had to wedge himself into the reeking guts of a medieval outhouse, a damp, foul-smelling pit used daily by the royal backside, surrounded by the stench of human waste, waiting for his moment. Hours, maybe even days, stewing in filth until the king finally arrived to take his seat. When Edmund Ironside came, the assassin struck with brutal precision, driving the blade upward into the king's body from below. No duel, no clash of steel, just a quick and dirty strike. Ironside might have been unbreakable in battle, but nobody's invincible on the privy. Sigurd of Orkney, Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney, had all the makings of a Viking legend. He'd carved out dominion over northern Scotland, built a reputation as a warlord mothers warned their children about, and lived the Viking dream of taking what he wanted with axe and fire. After clashing with a Scottish chieftain named Mael Brigthed, Sigurd naturally emerged the victor, but in proper Viking fashion. Just winning wasn't enough. Glory demanded souvenirs. To a Viking warlord, leaving the battlefield empty-handed was practically an insult to Odin himself. So he did what any self-respecting Norseman would do. He hacked off his fallen enemy's head, the blood still wet on his blade, and proudly lashed it to his saddle like a grotesque trophy. This wasn't just a decoration, it was a declaration. This is what happens when you stand against me. Sigurd pictured himself riding into Orkney to thunderous cheers, skalds lining up to compose sagas about the day he rode home with a chieftain's skull dangling at his side like a Viking hood ornament. But in his blood-soaked enthusiasm, Sigurd overlooked one inconvenient fact. Teeth don't stop being sharp just because the head they belong to has stopped issuing orders. And as Sigurd's horse clattered across the rugged Scottish countryside, that severed head swung and bumped with every stride. Slowly, rhythmically, Mael Brigted's mouth pressed against the earl's thigh, his jagged molars raking the same spot again and again. At first, it was probably just an annoyance, a scrape, a sting, the kind of irritation a hardened warrior would laugh off. But mile after mile, the grim little dental assault continued, turning a nuisance into an open wound, and an open wound into something far more dangerous. Infection. The great Viking earl who had smashed armies and toppled chieftains was suddenly brought low by a tooth. Chroniclers later called it the revenge of the severed head, a poetic way of saying Sigurd was killed by bad oral hygiene. Mael Brigthed had found a way to take revenge, not in life, but in death. Proof that sometimes the dead get the last laugh. Thanks for hanging out. Be safe.